The moon was a sliver of bone, a knife blade's edge hanging in the bruised purple sky over the upper Rio Grande basin. It offered no kindness, only a pale, judging light that made the shadows of the saguaro cactus stretch like grasping fingers across the baked earth. The year was 1878, and the land was deep in the teeth of a drought that had cracked the ground into a map of despair. Wind, the land's only constant companion, whispered through the scrub, carrying not the scent of rain but the fine grit of Arizona and New Mexico dust that settled on everything, a constant, gritty reminder of thirst. Dasan moved through this landscape not as a visitor, but as a part of it, another shadow among many. At 27, his body was lean and hard, a testament to a life lived by the land's unforgiving rules. He was a Chiricahua Apache, a warrior whose battlefield was not always one of arrows and bullets, but of patience and survival. His face, calm and practical, was a mask carved by sun and wind, his eyes holding the stillness of the red rock canyons that were his home and his soul. His purpose was simple, elemental to keep the small clan that looked to him safe, to preserve their freedom in the labyrinth of stone and sky that had always been theirs. He paused, placing a hand against a rock face, feeling the faint coolness that hinted at a deep, slow seep of water. He had learned to read the land not with his eyes alone, but with every sense. The frantic scramble of a lizard, the distant, patient circling of vultures, the faintest scent of yucca root on the dry air. These were his words, his warnings, his promises. He was not looking for a fight, he was looking for life. And in this parched season, life was a treasure measured in drops. Miles away, the same bone-slice moon shone down on a different kind of traveler. Evelyn Hart, at 20, felt the grit in her teeth, in the folds of her dress, in the fine strands of blonde hair that had escaped her bonnet. She was the daughter of Missouri farmers, a people who understood the land in terms of furrows and fences, not seeps and shadows. Her hands, though calloused from chores, knew the feel of paper pages as well as they knew the feel of worn leather reins. She could read, a small magic that set her apart, and she knew horses with an intuition that made her father nod with quiet pride. She walked beside their family's wagon, her eyes on the horizon, but her mind was miles further west, in a place she had only ever seen in her dreams, a small grove of orange trees in California, their leaves glossy green, the air sweet with blossoms. That dream was the fuel that kept her moving, a private hope she carried through the endless, aching landscape. She murmured a soft word to the lead horse, a big chestnut gelding named Samson, and ran a hand down his dusty neck. He was tired. They were all tired. But California was a promise whispered on every weary footstep. The land here felt alien, hostile. It was a place to be endured, to be crossed, not to be known. Her world was the slow, rhythmic creak of wagon wheels and the low murmur of her parents' voices. A small, fragile bubble of civilization inching its way across a vast and indifferent wilderness. The talk in the dusty saloon at the edge of the territory was as cheap and raw as the whiskey. It was a place where rumors were born and prejudices were nursed like a warm beer. A burly man with a sweat-stained hat slammed his glass down. "They are shadows," he declared to anyone who would listen. "Apaches. They come in the night, take your horses, and vanish. You never see them, just the empty space where your property used to be." Nods of agreement rippled through the smoky room. The word Apache was a curse, a ghost story told to frightened children and grown men alike. It meant savagery, a darkness that haunted the edges of their maps and their courage. From the Apache perspective, looking down from the high mesas, the wagon trains were just as menacing. They were not individual families seeking a new life. They were a slow, creeping fire, a line of white canvas and iron-rimmed wheels that consumed the grass, drank the water holes dry, and pushed the deer and the antelope further into the mountains. They were an unstoppable force, a tide that never receded, bringing with them a world of fences and laws that had no place in the Red Canyons. In a cleaner, quieter corner of that same saloon, two men sat who saw this clash not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. Ransom Pike was a man whose ambition was as vast as the territory itself. He was building a railroad, a great iron spine that would connect the east to the west, and he saw the land not in terms of beauty or spirit, but in square miles to be acquired and exploited. His eyes were cold, calculating things, and they were fixed on the Thung Lung, the valley that the Apache called home. It was land rich in copper, and it stood directly in the path of his progress. Sitting across from him, sipping Pike's expensive whiskey, was Lieutenant Halford of the United States Cavalry. Halford was a man whose uniform was crisper than his morals. He wore the badge of federal authority, but his true allegiance was to the comforting weight of gold coin in his pocket. He was a man drowning in debt and ambition, and Ransom Pike was his lifeline. "The situation requires a firm hand, Lieutenant," Pike said, his voice a low rumble. "These mountains need to be cleared. For progress, for security." "My hands are tied," Halford replied, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Without provocation, without clear evidence of hostility, the federal government is reluctant to act. They talk of treaties, of reservations." Pike leaned forward, his smile thin and unpleasant. "Evidence can be a malleable thing. All it takes is the right incentive. An unfortunate incident, something to convince the bureaucrats back east that the region is unsafe, that the Apache are a threat that must be dealt with decisively." Halford took a slow drink, his eyes meeting Pike's over the rim of his glass. He did not need the details spelled out. He understood the dirty arithmetic of power and greed. An incident would be arranged. He would be paid to look the other way, and then paid again to act, to ride out with his troopers and enforce the railroad's version of peace. Dasan, miles from any saloon, found what he was looking for. A shallow basin in the rock, no bigger than his hand, held a few precious ounces of water. It was enough. He drank slowly, letting the cool liquid soothe his dry throat, then carefully filled the small water skin at his belt. Hope, in this land, was not a grand dream of distant orchards. It was the taste of water, the scent of a coming rain, the survival of his people for one more day, one more night under the thin, sharp moon. He rose and looked out across the valley, his valley. The red rocks seemed to glow in the fading light, a warm, vibrant color that was the lifeblood of his identity. He saw the distant, faint dust trail of the wagon train, and his face hardened, a spreading fire. He had to be the water that kept it from reaching his home. Evelyn dipped a ladle into their water barrel, the sound echoing hollowly. It was low, dangerously low. She gave a small portion to Samson, watching as he drank, then carried a bucket to her mother, who was tending a small cooking fire. Her mother's face was etched with weariness, but her eyes brightened when she saw her daughter. "Any trouble today?" her mother asked. "Just the usual," Evelyn answered, her voice soft. "Dust and distance." She did not speak of the growing fear, the feeling of being watched by the vast, empty land. She did not speak of the stories she had heard, stories of shadows who stole horses. Instead, she opened a worn copy of a book, its pages softened by many readings, and began to read aloud as the sky deepened to indigo. Her voice was a small, steady anchor of civilization against the immense silence of the wild. The moon climbed higher, a silent, impartial witness. It shone on a warrior guarding the heart of his ancestral home, on a young woman reading of faraway places by a flickering fire, and on two men in a saloon plotting to burn a bridge between two worlds, a bridge that had never even been built. It was a night like any other, pregnant with the unspoken tensions of the West, a place where freedom and order, honor and law, were drawing lines in the dust, waiting for the spark that would set the whole dry landscape ablaze. The air was still, heavy with the promise of conflict, and the thin moon looked on, its edge as sharp as the choice between love and hate, life and death. The quiet reading was shattered by a sound that did not belong in the vast, sleeping landscape. It was not the howl of a coyote or the rustle of a night creature. It was the sharp, ugly crack of a rifle. Another followed, then a volley, splintering the night's stillness. Evelyn's father lunged for his own rifle propped against the wagon wheel, his face a grim mask in the firelight. Her mother screamed her name, a sound swallowed by the sudden chaos. Figures on horseback erupted from the darkness, their forms indistinct, their voices a cacophony of whoops and yells meant to mimic the terror of legend. A bullet tore through the canvas cover of the wagon. Another thudded into the water barrel, sending a precious stream arcing into the dust. The world dissolved into a blur of smoke. Panicked horses and shouting. Her father shoved the reins of Samson, the big chestnut, into her hands. "Ride. Evelyn. Go now. Do not stop." His command was absolute, a desperate prayer against the unfolding nightmare. She scrambled onto the horse's bare back, her book falling forgotten into the dirt. She saw her mother trying to reload a pistol, her father returning fire from behind the wagon. Then a horseman loomed out of the swirling dust, his face painted in grotesque stripes, and she kicked Samson into a desperate gallop, the sounds of the attack receding into a roar of fear in her ears. This was not a flight of strategy, it was pure animal instinct. She clung to Samson's mane, her body low, the wind tearing at her hair and clothes. She did not look back. To look back was to invite a horror she could not face. She rode blindly, letting the terrified horse choose the path, plunging through thickets of creosote and thorny mesquite that tore at her dress and skin like angry claws. The branches whipped at her face, leaving stinging red lines. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, the coppery tang a sharp point of focus in the chaos of her mind. In those first few moments of flight, the girl who dreamed of orange groves vanished. In her place was a young woman whose only reality was the straining muscles of the horse beneath her and the raw, screaming need to survive. She rode until the sounds of gunfire faded completely, until the only sound was the horse's ragged breathing and the frantic beating of her own heart. She rode until the moon began to pale, and then she rode on. As the sun rose, it brought no comfort, only a brutal, baking heat that turned the land into a furnace. Her thirst became a physical presence, a rasping torment in her throat. The world began to shimmer and warp at the edges. Samson, lathered in sweat and dust, slowed to a walk, his head hanging low. Evelyn's strength gave out. She slid from his back, her legs buckling beneath her, and collapsed onto the hot, unforgiving ground. Her last conscious thought was of a cool glass of water, a memory so vivid it was an agony. Dasan had heard the gunfire miles away. It was a familiar sound, but the rhythm was wrong. It was ragged, undisciplined. It was not the sound of a hunt, nor was it the sound of his people defending their land. He moved toward it with the fluid silence that was his birthright, a ghost in the landscape. When he arrived at the wagon, the scene was one of quiet devastation. The bodies of the man and woman lay near the fire, now a bed of cold ashes. The wagon was ransacked, its contents strewn across the dirt. Vultures were already beginning to gather in the sky, their patient circles a grim punctuation to the tragedy. But Dasan's eyes were on the ground. He knelt, his fingers tracing the deep prints in the dust, heavy horses shod with steel. He saw the marks of cavalry-style shoes, the kind favored by soldiers and hired men. He found a brass cartridge casing near the wagon wheel, glinting in the morning sun. He picked it up. It was a Henry rifle round, a repeating rifle, not the weapons of his people. His jaw tightened. This was a lie, a story written in gunpowder and blood to be read by fools. It was a lie designed to bring soldiers into his mountains. His gaze followed the chaotic mess of tracks leading away from the raid, but one set drew his attention. A single horse, unshod, moving fast, breaking away from the rest. He followed it. It was a trail of desperation, marked by broken branches and the frantic, deep hoof prints of a horse pushed to its limit. For hours he followed, his pace steady, his eyes missing nothing. He was not tracking an enemy. He was tracking a victim, a loose thread in the lie that had been woven here. He found the chestnut gelding first, standing with its head down, reins trailing in the dust. too exhausted to wander. And then he saw her, a crumpled heap of torn blue fabric and pale hair lying in the meager shade of a palo verde tree. He approached with caution, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. He stood over her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Her dress was shredded. Her arms and one shoulder were scratched and bleeding. Her face was flushed with sun and fever, her lips cracked and white with dust. She was so still he thought she might already be dead. A conflict, sharp and unwelcome, rose within him. She was one of them, a part of the fire that was consuming his world. Her presence here, in his land, was a danger. To help her was to invite that danger closer, to risk the safety of his family, his clan. The practical, warrior part of his mind told him to turn away. She was not his responsibility. Her world had brought this upon her. But another part, a deeper instinct, refused. To leave her to the sun and the vultures was an act of cruelty he could not commit. It was a surrender to the very brutality he fought against. His honor was not a thing to be bartered for safety. It was who he was. He made his choice. Uncorking the small water skin from his belt, he knelt and placed it on the ground, just within her reach. He did not touch her. He did not speak. Then he rose and stepped back, melting into the shadows of the rocks a dozen yards away. He waited. It was the horse's soft nicker that finally roused her. Evelyn's eyes fluttered open to a world of blinding light and searing pain. Her throat felt like it was filled with sand. Then she saw it, the water skin. It seemed a mirage, a cruel trick of her heat-addled mind, but it was real. With a sob of relief, she crawled toward it, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp the stopper. She drank, the water a shocking, life-giving miracle in her scorched throat. She drank until the skin was half empty. Then she stopped, a new fear cutting through her relief. Where had it come from? Her head snapped up, her eyes wide and terrified as she scanned the silent, empty landscape. She was not alone. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. A choked gasp escaped her lips. From the shadows, a figure detached itself from the rocks. A man. He was tall and lean, his skin the color of the red earth, his black hair long and unbound. He moved with a quiet grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. He stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes watching her, his expression impossible to read. "You are not dead," he said. His voice was low and calm, with no inflection she could decipher. "Do not be loud." Evelyn stared, her heart hammering against her ribs. The stories from the saloon, the painted faces from the night before. It all came rushing back in a wave of pure terror. He was one of them. A shadow from the darkness. "Are you a robber?" The question came out as a ragged whisper. A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "No," he said. "If I were a robber, I would have been quieter." As she absorbed his words, he knelt and picked up one of Samson's hooves. Examining the worn iron shoe, he let it drop, and his gaze swept the ground around her, finally settling on a small, dark object half buried in the dust. He picked it up and held it in his palm. It was a steel horseshoe, a perfect C-shape stamped with a farrier's mark, not Apache. He glanced back at the brass rifle casing he still carried. The evidence was clear, a story only he could read. Back at the fort, a rider delivered a hasty report to Lieutenant Halford. The wagon train was hit. He said, "Just like Mr. Pike predicted. Survivors say it was an Apache war party." Halford nodded slowly, a grim, official mask settling over his features. He reached for a pen and a sheet of paper. Ransom Pike had promised him a substantial sum for clear evidence. And now, thanks to a few dead farmers and a conveniently terrified group of survivors, he had all the evidence he needed to write his report and to unleash the dogs of war on the people of the Red Rock Canyons. The official story had begun. He led her away from the place where she had fallen, retrieving her horse with a quiet command that the animal seemed to understand. He moved with an economy of motion, his steps sure and silent on the rocky ground. Evelyn followed, her legs unsteady, her mind a numb fog of shock and grief. She did not know his name, nor did she know where he was taking her. She only knew that he had given her water, and for now, that was enough to make him an anchor in a world that had come undone. Their journey was a blur of sun and stone. He seemed to find paths where she saw only impassable rockfalls and dense thickets of thorned bushes. He led her to a narrow opening in a cliff face, so well hidden by a curtain of ancient, dried vines that she would have walked past it 1,000 times without a second glance. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dust and dry stone. The cave was not deep, more of a wide, hollowed-out ledge, but it was sheltered from the relentless sun and wind. From its mouth, she could see a vast, shimmering salt pan stretching to the horizon, a white, sterile sea under the hard blue sky. It felt like the edge of the world. For the first day, she did little more than sleep, her body succumbing to an exhaustion so profound it felt like a sickness. When she was awake, she watched him. He moved with a quiet purpose, never wasting a step or emotion. He took a bundle of dried yucca leaves and, with surprising speed, wove a small, tight screen that he propped at the entrance, angling it to provide more shade without blocking the breeze. He showed her a barrel cactus growing near the cave. He sliced the top off with his knife, revealing the watery pulp inside. "This is water," he said, his voice flat and instructive. He mashed the pulp with the handle of his knife and scooped some of the liquid into a cup he had fashioned from a gourd. It was not sweet or clean like well water, but it was wet, and it was life. She drank it gratefully, the strange, slightly bitter taste a reminder of where she was. Her fear was a constant, cold knot in her stomach. Every legend she had ever heard about the Apache people swirled in her head, tales of violence and cruelty. Yet, the man who had found her did not fit those stories. He was distant, silent, but he was not cruel. He had given her water. He had given her shelter. Her curiosity, a stubborn and resilient part of her nature, began to push through the fear. She started to watch him not as a monster from a story, but as a man. He was meticulously observant. On the second day, she felt strong enough to tend to Samson, who was tethered in a small, hidden box canyon nearby where a few tufts of dry grass grew. She checked the cinch on the saddle, a task she had performed 1,000 times. He watched her from a distance. When she finished, he walked over. "You tie a saddle like you tie a thread," he stated, not unkindly, but with the simple finality of fact. "It will come apart in a mile." He did not wait for her to respond. He simply untied her knot and, with a few deft movements, retied it into something solid and unshakable. He tapped it with his knuckles. "That will hold." She felt a flush of embarrassment, but also a grudging respect. He was right. Her knot had been sufficient for the gentle trails of Missouri, not for this rugged, vertical land. The silence between them was vast, filled only by the whisper of the wind. She found herself trying to fill it, to make some sort of human connection. She watched him staring out at the sun-bleached landscape, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Do you always frown like that?" she asked, her voice sounding small in the open space. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes fixing on her. "The sun does it for me," he said, and then turned back to his watch. The conversation was over, yet it was the most he had said to her that was not a direct instruction, and she held on to it like a small treasure. He taught her how to live in this new, harsh world. He showed her how to build a snare from a bit of sinew and a bent branch. And the next morning, a rabbit was in the trap. He skinned and cleaned it with an efficiency that was both fascinating and brutal to watch. He showed her how to smoke the meat over a small, nearly smokeless fire built in a pit, preserving it for later. When she burned her hand on a hot rock near the fire, he wordlessly took a handful of cool ash from an old fire pit and spread it over the red mark. The sting subsided almost immediately. She tried to make herself useful. She gathered the scarce firewood, her hands growing tougher, her eyes learning to spot the dry, dead branches of mesquite. She learned to start the fire herself, using a piece of flint he gave her and a bit of dried grass tinder. The first time she succeeded in coaxing a flame to life, a small, triumphant smile touched her lips. "First time I lit a stove without burning my hair," she murmured to herself. He heard her. A corner of his mouth twitched, a barely perceptible movement. It was not a smile, but it was close, and it made her feel a little less alone. One afternoon, he stiffened, his gaze fixed on the southern horizon. Evelyn followed his line of sight and saw it too, a thin plume of smoke rising into the sky. Miles away. It was not the smoke of a cooking fire. It was too dark, too thick. "Cavalry," he said, the single word sharp and hard. "How do you know?" "The smoke is careless. They burn what they find." He disappeared for an hour, and when he returned, his expression was grim. "They are sweeping the southern slopes. Their horses are shod. The iron leaves a clear mark." The news sent a chill of fear through her. The soldiers were supposed to be a symbol of safety, of rescue. But if they found her here, with him, what would they think? What story would they believe? The poster for a medicine show she had once seen flashed in her mind, a caricature of a savage warrior dragging a helpless white woman away. She was now the woman in that picture. The world was turned upside down. Justice and danger had traded faces. That evening, the mood in the small cave was somber. The threat on the horizon made her own loss feel sharp and immediate again. She pulled a small, folded piece of paper from a hidden pocket in her dress. It was a letter from her mother, received just before they had left Missouri. The paper was soft and creased, stained with sweat and grime from her journey. But the familiar handwriting was a lifeline to a world that no longer existed. She clutched it in her hand, the sharp corners digging into her palm. "I wanted to plant orange trees," she said, the words coming out in a quiet rush. "In California. My mother said the air smells sweet all year." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She did not know why she was telling him this, only that the silence had become unbearable. He was quiet for a long time, watching the last light fade from the sky, painting the distant mountains in shades of purple and orange. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "That mountain," he said, nodding toward the highest peak, "is called Ijagod, the place of the bighorn sheep, and the smaller one, the one that looks like a sleeping woman. We call her Shima, the mother." He spoke the Apache words as if they were stones, solid and real and ancient. He had not offered sympathy or platitudes. He had offered something else entirely, a piece of his own world. He had given her names for the silent, imposing land, turning it from a place of fear into a place with a story. Still, a chasm of caution remained between them. He had saved her, and he was protecting her, but he did not truly trust her. He never led her back to his people, to the hidden camp she knew must exist somewhere in these mountains. He was keeping her separate, a dangerous secret he could not share, and she, in turn, kept her own secrets. She did not tell him about her father's small savings, sewn into the hem of his coat. She did not speak of the arguments her parents had about the wisdom of the journey. She kept her family, the memory of them, a private, sacred space inside her. They were two people sharing a fire, a shelter, a fragile existence. But their pasts and their futures remained their own. Every night, he would give her the deerskin blanket he carried rolled up on his back. It was soft and smelled faintly of wood smoke and him. She would wrap herself in it, the warmth a small comfort against the cold desert night. He would lie on the other side of the fire pit, near the cave's entrance, a silent guardian with only a knife for a pillow. The blanket was a kindness, a shield against the cold, but it was also a boundary. It was his, and she was only borrowing it. It was a line drawn on the stone floor between them, a fragile, Unspoken agreement in a world where trust was not a gift to be given, but a skill to be learned. One painful, cautious lesson at a time. The weather turned without warning. A wind from the north, born in the high, cold peaks, descended into the basin, scouring the land. It was a physical presence, a bully that shoved its way into the small cave, stripping the warmth from the air and from their bodies. The small fire they kept was no match for it. The flames flattened, cowering against the stones of the fire pit, and the heat was snatched away as soon as it rose. Dasan had given her the deerskin blanket as always, and she had huddled in it, her back against the rock wall, trying to find a place the wind could not reach. He lay by the entrance, a silent silhouette against the star-dusted sky, the wind tearing at his unbound hair. Sleep offered little escape. The cold seeped through the blanket, through her worn dress, and settled deep in her bones. Evelyn woke sometime in the deepest part of the night, shivering so hard her teeth chattered. The fire had died down to a bed of glowing red embers, a fading pulse of warmth in the encroaching dark. A profound and desperate instinct took over, a primal need for warmth that overrode conscious thought. In the disorienting blackness, half awake and driven by the deep chill, she began to move. She was not thinking of him, not thinking of boundaries or propriety. She was a creature seeking heat, crawling toward the memory of the fire, toward the faint radiating warmth of another living body. Her hand touched not the cold stone floor, but the hard muscle of his back. He was awake before she even reached him. Every nerve in his body was instantly alert, his hand closing around the hilt of his knife. His training screamed at him of danger, of an enemy in the dark. But the scent that reached him was not of dust and leather and threat. It was the faint, clean scent of her hair and the soft sound of her shivering breath. He went utterly still, a statue of coiled tension, as she blindly sought shelter beside him, curling into a tight ball, her back pressing against his side. The shock of her closeness was a jolt, a silent clap of thunder in the small space. His first instinct was to move away, to re-establish the careful distance he had maintained between them. That was the safe thing to do, the wise thing. She was a world of trouble, a complication he could not afford, but he did not move. He felt the tremors that ran through her body from the cold. He could feel her life, a fragile, trembling thing beside his own. She was not a symbol of the encroaching world, not a white woman, not a danger. In that moment, she was just a girl, cold and alone and seeking warmth in the dark. A virgin slipped into his bed by accident. An Apache stayed awake, burned all night choosing her forever. He lay there, rigid, listening to the sound of her breathing as it slowly deepened and evened out, her shivering subsiding as she absorbed the heat from his body. The wind howled outside, but inside their shared space, a fragile peace had settled. He did not touch her. He did not shift or adjust his position. He simply lay there, a human wall between her and the cold. After a long time, moving with infinite slowness, he reached for the edge of the deerskin blanket that she had dragged with her and pulled it higher, tucking it carefully around her shoulders. Then he stared into the darkness, his eyes wide open, and began his vigil. The night was a crucible. Every doubt, every fear, every practical reason to abandon her warred with the simple, undeniable reality of the woman sleeping beside him. To protect her meant inviting the full wrath of her world down upon his own. It meant becoming the monster from their stories. It meant putting his own people at risk for a stranger, an outsider. Yet, to cast her out now, to send her away, felt like a betrayal not of her, but of himself. It was a kind of surrender, an admission that his honor was a thing that could be compromised for convenience. He watched the constellations wheel slowly across the sky, their cold, distant light offering no answers. The choice was his alone. The fire in the pit had dwindled to ash, but a different kind of fire was ignited in him, a slow, steady burn of resolve. He would not abandon her. He could not. By the time the first pale gray light of dawn began to dilute the darkness, the choice had been forged into certainty. Her life was now tied to his. Her safety was his responsibility. Evelyn woke slowly, drawn from a deep and dreamless sleep by a sense of profound warmth and security she had not felt since before the attack. For a moment, she thought she was back in her own bed in Missouri, the heavy quilt tucked around her. Then her eyes opened. She was not looking at the familiar ceiling of her room, but at the rough, worn leather of Dassan's shirt, inches from her face. The horrifying, embarrassing reality of her position crashed down on her. She was pressed against him, wrapped in his blanket, in his sleeping space. She froze, her cheeks flooding with heat, her heart beginning to pound with a mixture of shame and fear. She tried to pull away, but her limbs felt heavy, tangled in the deerskin. He spoke before she could move, his voice a low rumble beside her ear. "I watched while you slept." It was not an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact, but it carried the weight of the entire night. She looked up at his face in the dim morning light. He was not frowning. His expression was calm, his dark eyes clear and steady. The fierce, intimidating warrior was gone, and in his place was a man who looked tired, but resolute. I am sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I was so cold, I did not mean to—" "Do not be," he said, his gaze unwavering. "The night is cold enough that survival is its own apology." In his words, in his gaze, she felt a fundamental shift. The invisible wall that had stood between them had crumbled in the night. He was no longer just her reluctant protector or a mysterious, frightening figure. He was Dassan, a man who had sheltered her with his own body and had stayed awake to guard her sleep. She saw him, truly saw him for the first time, as a person, and the sight left her breathless. The moment was broken by a sound from outside, sharp and alien in the morning quiet. The distinct, metallic ring of a shod horse stepping on stone, then another. Dassan was on his feet in a single, fluid motion, all trace of weariness gone. He held a finger to his lips, his body radiating a sudden, intense urgency. He moved to the edge of the cave mouth, peering through a small gap in the yucca screen. His face was a hard, emotionless mask, but his eyes were alive with calculation. He turned back to her, his voice a harsh whisper. "Soldiers, we go, now." Panic seized her, but the look on his face demanded obedience. She scrambled to her feet, pulling the deerskin blanket around her like a cloak. He did not gather their meager supplies. There was no time. He went to the back of the cave, to a place that had looked like a solid wall of rock, and pushed against a large, flat stone. It pivoted inward with a low, grinding sound, revealing a dark, narrow fissure. He beckoned to her, and without hesitation, she followed him into the tight, claustrophobic darkness. Outside, Lieutenant Halford reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the cliff face with a predatory gleam. One of his scouts had pointed to a faint wisp of dissipating smoke, a sign so small Halford would have missed it. "Probably just a lightning strike from last week, sir," the scout said, uncertain. Halford sneered. "Lightning does not smell like rabbit. Corporal, find the source." His men dismounted, their carbines held at the ready. It did not take them long to find the cave. The yucca screen a pathetic attempt at concealment in Halford's eyes. He strode into the opening, his boots crunching on the stone floor. The place was empty, but the faint scent of wood smoke still hung in the air. The ashes in the fire pit were still warm to the touch. "They were here," he said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "And they left in a hurry." He kicked at the deerskin blanket she had left behind in her haste. He saw the small, cleared sleeping areas. 2 of them. His lip curled in a self-righteous sneer. Then his eye caught a tiny speck of color on the dusty floor near the fire pit. He bent down and picked it up. It was a single thread of blue cotton, frayed and worn, the exact color of a Missouri farmer's daughter's dress. He held it up to the light, a small, damning piece of evidence. He was no longer just following orders or chasing a rumor. This made it real. He was on the trail of a captured woman, a damsel to be rescued from the clutches of a savage. Or, at the very least, that was the story he would tell. "Find their trail," he commanded his men, his voice ringing with a newfound sense of purpose. "I want the girl, and I want the Indian who took her." The fissure was a tight, suffocating passage that scraped at their shoulders and stole their breath. It twisted through the heart of the rock, a secret vein known only to the mountain's children. They emerged, blinking, into the harsh sunlight on the far side of the cliff. The soldiers' shouts, now a faint, frustrated echo. They did not stop. Dasan led them into the labyrinth of canyons, his pace relentless, putting as much distance and confusing stone between them and their pursuers as possible. For 2 days they traveled, sustained by smoked rabbit and the water from barrel cactus. The shared danger and the memory of the cold night had forged a new understanding between them. The silence was no longer a chasm of mistrust, but a space of shared purpose. "We cannot go back to your wagon," he said as they rested in the shade of an overhang. "And I cannot go to my people. I would lead the soldiers to them." "What do we do?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was steady, stripped of the panic that had first consumed her. The wilderness had burned the fragility from her, leaving a core of resilient steel. "My people have been blamed for a crime they did not commit," Dasan said, his eyes fixed on the distant, hazy plains. "Your family has been attacked. The stories are connected. We need proof of the lie, and you need to find if any of your family survived." The two missions were now one, a single path leading out of the wilderness and into the world of men, a world that was, in its own way, far more dangerous than the desert. He knew of a place, a small, dusty town called Redemption, that squatted on the edge of the territory. It was a place of last chances and forgotten histories, and it had a man who might listen. They approached the town from the south, circling wide to avoid the main trail. Dasan left Samson and his own horse hidden in a dry wash, then led Evelyn on foot through the scrubby outskirts. The first sign of civilization was not a welcome sight. Nailed to a crooked post was a crude, hand-painted sign, "No Indians after sundown." Dasan's face showed no reaction, but a quiet tension settled in his shoulders. "Wait here," he told her, indicating a spot behind the town's livery stable, a place that smelled of hay and manure. When she was safely out of sight, he moved through the back alleys, a shadow flitting between buildings, his presence an illegal act in the fading light. He emerged at the back door of a long, low adobe building from which came the faint sounds of a mournful guitar and low voices. He did not knock. He simply opened the door and stepped inside. The saloon was called Maria's Tears. The man behind the bar was Tio Miguel, a man with a face like a dried riverbed and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He had once been a border guard, a life that had taught him the difference between the law and the truth. He looked up, saw Dasan, and his expression did not change. He simply polished a glass with a rag, his movements slow and deliberate. "The north wind blows cold," Miguel said, his voice a gravelly murmur. Dasan nodded. "It brings lies with it." Miguel grunted, a sound of weary agreement. He poured a small measure of whiskey and pushed it across the bar. He knew Dasan would not drink it, but it was an offering, a gesture of respect. Before Dasan could speak, the saloon doors burst open and a whirlwind of dust and energy entered. It was Nellie, the mail rider. She was a woman in her late 20s, her face leathered by the sun, her eyes as bright and quick as a desert hawk's. She threw a mailbag onto the bar. "Whiskey, Miguel," she said, her voice raspy. "The trail is dry enough to choke a lizard. The whole territory is buzzing. Pike's Railroad is pushing through to the copper deposits in the Red Valley. Word is, he is in a hurry to clear the land." She downed the whiskey Miguel poured in a single gulp. Then her sharp eyes landed on Dasan, who had remained silent in the corner. She looked him up and down, her gaze missing nothing. "You are not much of a talker, are you?" she said, her tone a mix of curiosity and challenge. Dasan met her gaze. "Long road," he said, heavy words. Nellie laughed. "A short, sharp sound. I like that." Evelyn, meanwhile, was fighting her own battle. She had pulled her bonnet low to hide the scratches on her face and walked with a forced confidence down the town's single dusty street to the telegraph office. The air was thick with the stares of rough-looking men who lounged on the boardwalks. She ignored them. Her focus narrowed to the small sign hanging over the door. Inside, a clerk with a green eye shade barely looked up as she wrote her message on a slip of paper, her hand trembling slightly. It was a desperate shot into the dark, addressed to the sheriff of the next major town down the line, asking for any news of survivors from the Hartwagon train. She paid the man, her few remaining coins feeling impossibly small in her palm. Then began the agonizing wait for a reply that might never come. She returned to the alley behind the saloon, her heart a cold, tight knot. Dasan was there, speaking in low tones with Miguel. He saw her approach, and the question was plain in his eyes. She could only shake her head. Nothing yet. As the sun set, the town grew louder, the saloon spilling yellow light and raucous noise into the street. Two men stumbled into Maria's tears, their spurs ringing on the floorboards. They wore gun belts slung low, and their faces held the arrogant swagger of men who were paid to be mean. Evelyn, peering through a crack in the back door, recognized the brand on a wooden crate they had just unloaded from a wagon outside a stylized RP. Ransom Pike's men. The men were loud and drunk. One of them slammed his hand on the bar, demanding another bottle. His eyes fell on a quiet old man nursing a beer in the corner. "What are you looking at?" Old man, the hired gun, slurred. Miguel moved from behind the bar. "That is enough, boys. Pay your bill and move on." The second man laughed. "A nasty, grating sound. We ain't going nowhere. Pike owns this town now." He turned and spat on the floor, deliberately close to where Dasan stood in the shadows, and were cleaning out all the trash. Before anyone could react, Dasan moved. It was not a charge, it was an unfolding, a blur of motion as swift and silent as a striking snake. He did not draw his knife. He did not throw a punch. He grabbed a horse rein hanging from a peg on the wall. In one fluid motion, he looped it around the first man's ankles and pulled. The man crashed to the floor, his gun clattering away. The second man, stunned, reached for his own pistol. But Dasan was already there. He kicked a chair out from under a table, sending it spinning into the man's legs, buckling his knees. As the man fell forward, Dasan brought his hand down in a hard, precise chop to the back of his neck. The man crumpled, unconscious. The entire fight had lasted less than 5 seconds. It had been clean, practical, and utterly decisive. The saloon was dead silent. Nellie stared, her mouth slightly agape. Tio Miguel simply picked up the spittoon and moved it over the spot on the floor, his expression unchanged. Just then, a sound came from the front of the town, a high-pitched, insistent clicking. The telegraph. Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. She ran, heedless of the stairs. Dasan, a protective shadow close behind her. She burst into the office as the clerk was transcribing the message. He handed her the slip of paper without a word. Her eyes scanned the decoded dots and dashes. 2 bodies recovered from Hartwagon identified as Martha Hart and her husband, John. No other survivors reported at scene. Her hope died. Then she read the next line. 1 male survivor, Albert Hart, later located, currently being held at Dry Willow Camp for his own protection. Albert, her father. He was alive. A strangled sob of relief escaped her, but the relief was instantly poisoned by the final lines. Camp is under contract to Pike Rail Company. Access restricted. Hart is not permitted visitors. He was not being protected. He was a prisoner, a hostage. As she stood there, the world swaying around her, Nellie appeared at the doorway, a sheet of paper in her hand. She had ripped it from the wall of the post office. Her face was grim. "You need to see this," she said, handing it to Evelyn. It was a wanted poster. The ink was still fresh, It offered a reward for the capture of a renegade Apache warrior, charged with the abduction of a white woman. At the bottom of the page, beneath a crude, inaccurate sketch, was a name, his name, Dasan. The law, stamped and sealed, had officially become the lie. Justice now depended not on a man with a badge, but on a renegade Apache, a heartbroken daughter, a cynical saloon owner, and a male rider with a fast horse. And the truth was a hostage, locked away in a camp called Dry Willow. The wanted poster was a declaration of war. It turned Dasan from a ghost into a target, a name with a price on it. In the back room of Maria's tears, with the muted sounds of the saloon filtering through the thick adobe walls, the four of them formed a council of outlaws. Miguel, his face a roadmap of hard-won wisdom, drew a rough map in a patch of spilled whiskey on the table. "The railroad is Pike's artery," he said, his voice a low growl. "It pumps men and supplies to his heart, the new copper mine in the Red Valley. If there is a record of his dirty dealings, it will be there." "They cannot be holding your father at the main camp," Nellie added, leaning forward, her quick eyes darting between them. "Too many witnesses." Dry Willow is a small supply depot a few miles from the mine itself, isolated, perfect for keeping a man quiet. The path was clear, a thin, dangerous trail through a landscape of lies. They had to get into that mine. They needed the proof that would dismantle Pike's story and free Evelyn's father. To do that, they needed to follow the artery. Night fell, and the moon was a sliver again, offering little light. Dasan and Evelyn moved through the darkness, following the cold, unyielding lines of the newly laid railroad track. The steel rails were a violation of the land, a pair of scars that ran straight and true, ignoring the gentle curves of the hills and the winding paths of the animals. They hummed with a faint, deep vibration, a promise of the immense weight and power that was coming. Progress, Evelyn thought, felt like a cold, iron cage being built around the world. Dasan moved with a hunter's grace, his feet finding the quiet spaces between the wooden ties. He was a creature of the earth forced to walk a line of cold steel, and the tension in his posture was palpable. Evelyn followed, her own steps now more practiced, quieter than they had ever been. She had learned to read the ground, to feel the shift of a loose stone under her boot, to listen to the whisper of the wind as a warning. The mine was a wound in the side of the mountain. It was a chaotic jumble of raw timber buildings, piles of tailings like gray, dead mountains, and the dark, gaping mouth of the mine shaft itself. Lanterns cast long, dancing shadows, and the air smelled of coal smoke, sweat, and shattered rock. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their rifles held with a lazy confidence. They were not soldiers, they were Pike's men, their silhouettes bulky and menacing in the flickering light. Dasan led her to a high vantage point on the ridge overlooking the camp. For an hour, they lay motionless, watching. He was not just looking, he was absorbing the rhythm of the place. He counted the guards. He noted the timing of their patrols, the way one would stop to light a cigarette, the way another would stamp his feet against the cold. He saw where the main office was, a larger, sturdier building with a single lamp burning in its window, near the supply shed. He pointed. "Look!" Evelyn squinted, her eyes following his gesture. There was a stack of long wooden crates, even from this distance. She could make out the stenciled letters on their sides. U.S. Army, ammunition, the same kind of military-issue supplies that must have been used in the attack on her family. The connection was no longer a suspicion. It was a hard, cold fact sitting right in front of them. "The office is our only chance," Dasan whispered, his breath a warm puff in the cold air. "The records will be in there." "But how?" Evelyn asked, her own voice a hush. "There are 2 guards at the door, and another who walks past every few minutes." A silence fell between them as they watched the seemingly impenetrable camp. Evelyn's mind raced. The helpless girl who had collapsed in the desert was a distant memory. She was a part of this now, a player in the game. An idea, desperate and dangerous, took root. "I can create a diversion," she said, the words coming out stronger than she expected. "I can walk toward the main gate. They will be so surprised to see a woman out here, alone. It will draw them all. It would give you time." Dasan turned his head, and in the dim moonlight, she saw the hard set of his jaw. His eyes were dark and intense. "No," he said. The word was final. "Absolute. I do not trade people for evidence." His refusal was not a rebuke. It was a statement of principle, a line drawn in the sand of his soul. In that moment, Evelyn's trust in him became something solid and unbreakable. He was not just protecting her life, he was protecting her. He would not use her, not even to save himself or his people. He would find another way. And he did. His eyes scanned the mine works, the complex web of ropes, pulleys, and machinery. His gaze settled on the large hoist mechanism that lowered a wooden cage into the mine shaft. A plan, audacious and precise, formed in his mind. He explained it to her in low, urgent whispers. It was a plan that required silence, speed, and a very particular kind of chaos. They circled around the back of the camp, using the noise of a distant steam engine to cover the sound of their movement. They found what they were looking for near the cookhouse, a small sack of dried red chili peppers. Dasan moved like a ghost toward the mine shaft. Evelyn held her breath, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched as he climbed the timber frame of the hoist, his knife held between his teeth, with a few quick, silent cuts. He severed the thick rope that held the counterweight for the lift. The heavy cage dropped a few feet with a groaning shudder, then jammed in the shaft. It was enough. He rejoined her, and they crept toward the back of the office building. He built a tiny fire, no bigger than his hand, shielding its glow with his body. He crushed the dried chilies into a fine, acrid powder and dropped them onto the embers. A thick, choking smoke began to rise. He fanned it with his hand, directing the plume toward the open window of the office. Inside, the two guards who had been playing cards suddenly began to cough. The coughs became deeper, racking spasms. One of them stumbled to the door, his eyes streaming, and threw it open, gasping for fresh air. His partner followed, collapsing to his knees, his face red and contorted. The patrol guard ran over to see what the commotion was, and he too was hit by the invisible, burning cloud. The diversion was perfect, while the men were doubled over, blinded and fighting for breath. Dasan and Evelyn slipped through the now unguarded door. The office was simple, a desk, a chair, and a large, heavy book lying open on the blotter, a payroll ledger. Dasan stood watch at the door while Evelyn ran her finger down the page. Her ability to read now, a weapon more powerful than any gun. Her fingers stopped. There it was, an entry, dated the same night as the attack on the wagon train. The writing was neat, clinical. Payment to Pike's boys. It read, "Special services rendered." The amount listed was enough to buy a man's silence a dozen times over. It was the golden proof. A shout from outside shattered their victory. They heard the sound of approaching horses, a lot of them, moving fast. Dasan peered through the window. "Halford," he hissed. They were trapped. The office had only one door. Dasan scanned the room and pointed to a connecting door that led to a large supply warehouse. They slipped through it just as the lieutenant and his troopers stormed into the office. The warehouse was a maze of crates, barrels, and mining equipment. They could hear Halford barking orders, his voice filled with triumphant rage. "Fan out! Find them! They are in here somewhere." They were cornered. The soldiers were methodical, moving through the aisles, their lanterns cutting through the gloom. There was no escape. Dasan pushed Evelyn behind a tall stack of crates, his body shielding hers, his knife in his hand. He would not be taken alive. Suddenly, a new sound split the night, a wild, frantic clanging. It was not a sound that belonged to a mine. It was the sound of the town's fire bell, being rung with a furious, desperate energy. Outside, shouts of confusion erupted from the soldiers. "What in the world is that?" Halford roared. From their hiding place, they could see through a grimy window. A lone figure on horseback was galloping through the camp, one hand on the reins, the other pulling a long rope tied to the clapper of the big cast-iron bell near the main gate. It was Nellie. She rode like a demon, her hair flying, creating a magnificent, chaotic diversion, her horse weaving between the stunned troopers. The distraction was all Dasan needed. He spotted a high shuttered window at the back of the warehouse. He boosted Evelyn up. She pushed the shutters open and scrambled through, dropping into the darkness outside. He followed in a single, athletic vault. They landed in the soft mud of a shallow creek bed that ran behind the building. They ran, using the creek as their path, the sounds of Nellie's bell and Halford's furious shouting slowly fading behind them. They did not stop until the mine was a distant, angry glow against the night sky. They met Nellie at a prearranged spot miles away. She was grinning, her horse lathered but unharmed. "Figured you boys might need a little help making a quiet exit," she said, patting her horse's neck. As they caught their breath, she pulled another piece of paper from her saddlebag. It was a new flyer, already being printed in town. Ransom Pike had upped the stakes. It offered a substantial reward not for a kidnapper, but for the safe return of Miss Evelyn Hart, a poor, confused young woman who had been tragically brainwashed by her savage captor. Evelyn stared at the paper. They had the proof to expose Pike's lies. But he had twisted the story again. He had turned her from a victim into a deluded captive, a prize to be won. The iron rails of his progress were not just crossing the land. They were encircling her, trying to pin her to a story that was not her own. She was no longer just fighting for her father. She was fighting for herself, for the truth of who she had become. The ledger page was a thin, fragile piece of paper, a flimsy shield against the iron and gunpowder of Ransom Pike's ambition. It was their only proof, a whisper of truth in a world shouting a lie. Nellie had taken the greater risk, promising to get copies made and to find a way to get them into the hands of someone who could not be bought, a circuit judge or a traveling preacher, someone whose authority came from a power higher than a railroad baron's money. For Dasan and Evelyn, the path was no longer forward, but inward. They were fugitives, a warrior with a price on his head and a woman officially labeled as his brainwashed captive. There was only one place left to go home. Their journey back into the Red Rock Canyons was different from the desperate flight that had first brought them together. Evelyn was no longer a terrified survivor. She moved with a quiet confidence, her eyes scanning the rocks for the signs he had taught her to read. She knew which plants held water, which stones offered shelter, how to walk without leaving a careless trail. The land was no longer an enemy. It was a difficult, demanding partner, and she was learning its dance. Dasan, too, had changed. The cautious, solitary protector was gone. He moved with a new weight on his shoulders, the burden of a choice that had tied his fate not only to this woman, but to the coming storm she represented. He was leading her to his people, an act of trust so profound it terrified him more than any soldier's bullet. They traveled for days, climbing higher into the mountains, into a world of soaring stone pillars and hidden, watered canyons. Finally, he led her through a narrow, winding pass that opened into a small, sheltered valley. It was a place of impossible beauty and life. A clear stream ran through a meadow of wild grasses, and nestled among the cottonwood trees were a dozen wickiups, their domed frames of willow and beargrass blending into the landscape. This was his home. Their arrival was met not with welcome, but with a silent, spreading alarm. Children who had been playing by the stream stopped their games and scattered like quail. Women looked up from their work, their expressions hardening into masks of suspicion. Men appeared, their hands resting on the knives at their belts or the bows slung over their shoulders. Their eyes were not on Dasan. They were fixed on Evelyn, a stark figure of white skin and a torn blue dress in their world of earth and stone. A warrior, taller than Dasan and with a deep scar running along his jaw, stepped forward. His name was Kale, and his eyes held a cold fire. "You bring this trouble to our homes," Dasan, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. You bring a ghost from their world into our sanctuary. She is not trouble, Dasan replied, his voice calm, but with an underlying edge of steel. She is a witness to a lie that has been told about us. Kale spat on the ground. She is the lie. Calamity rides in a white woman's dress. She will bring the soldiers down on us, on our children. Send her away. Let her world deal with her. Other warriors murmured their agreement, their face grim. Evelyn felt 100 hostile eyes on her, and she understood their fear. It was not simple hatred. It was the practical, desperate fear of a people who had been hunted and betrayed for generations. She was a symbol of the very force that threatened to extinguish them. An old woman emerged from the largest wickiup. Her face was a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, and her white hair was tied back with a simple leather thong. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of one who carried immense authority without ever needing to raise her voice. This was Allaha, Dasan's aunt, the clan's medicine woman, her eyes dark and luminous, passed over the angry warriors and settled on Evelyn. She saw not a symbol, but a person. She saw the exhaustion etched around Evelyn's eyes, the lingering fear, the stubborn set of her jaw. She is hurt, Allaha said, her voice quiet but carrying a weight that silenced the men. She is tired. Bring her. Allaha led Evelyn into her wickiup. The air inside was cool and smelled of sage, juniper, and 100 other dried herbs that hung in fragrant bundles from the willow frame. Allaha gestured for her to sit on a soft rabbit fur mat. She examined the half-healed scratches on Evelyn's arms and the deep, weary lines on her face. She took her hand, her own fingers surprisingly strong and warm. Later, as Evelyn rested, a council was held outside. She could hear the low, urgent murmur of their voices. Kale's words were sharp, angry. He spoke of the safety of the clan, of the risk she represented. Others joined him. They demanded that Dasan cast her out, that he choose his people over this stranger. The flap of the wickiup opened and Allaha entered, carrying a small clay bowl. She sat before Evelyn and spoke, her gaze direct and searching. They are afraid, she said. Fear is a strong current. It can carry a man a long way from his own heart. I know, Evelyn whispered. I do not want to bring them harm. I never wanted this. Allaha nodded slowly. She looked past Evelyn, as if seeing something far away. Water always seeks the lowest ground, she said, her voice a soft, melodic chant. The heart is the same. It seeks the place of greatest pain. Dasan's heart has found your pain. That evening, the decision was made. One of the elders, a man with a grave, somber face, came to Dasan. His words were heavy with the weight of his responsibility. She can stay until she is healed, the elder said. We will not turn away a guest who is under your protection, but you know the law. Dasan, if her presence brings the soldiers to this valley, we must all leave. We must abandon this place, our home, to the wind. The safety of the many cannot be sacrificed for the one. It was not a threat. It was a statement of their reality. The harsh arithmetic of survival. Dasan's choice was now a burden for his entire clan. He walked to the center of the camp, where the fire burned, and turned to face his people. Evelyn watched from the entrance of Allaha's wickiup, her heart aching with the weight of the trouble she had brought. I have heard your words, Dasan said, his voice clear and strong, ringing in the quiet evening air. You are right to be afraid, but fear will not turn a lie into truth. This woman is the key to proving that lie. I will not send her away. He paused, his eyes meeting Kale's, then the elders', then finally finding Evelyn's across the fire-lit space. I choose this person. His gaze held hers, a silent, powerful promise. Then he turned back to his people, his voice dropping, his words filled with a fierce, unbreakable love. But I will not sell the mountains for anyone. He had drawn his line. He would stand with Evelyn, but he would also stand with his people. He would not sacrifice one for the other. he would find a way to honor both. Over the next few days, Allah tended to Evelyn. It was a healing of the body and the spirit. She had Evelyn inhale the steam from a pot of boiled herbs, the fragrant vapor clearing her head and easing the tension in her chest. She made a poultice of crushed leaves and cool clay and applied it to the angry red scratches on her arms and shoulders, the gentle treatment soothing the inflamed skin. Evelyn accepted it all with a quiet gratitude. She did not pretend to understand their ways. She did not try to mimic their customs or act as if she belonged. She simply accepted their help with a deep and genuine respect, an acknowledgement that their knowledge of this land, of healing, was as valid and powerful as any doctor's in her own world. Her humility was its own kind of language. And in the watchful eyes of the women, she began to see a grudging acceptance replace the open hostility. Love, she was learning, did not erase the vast differences between them. It did not make him less Apache or her less a daughter of Missouri. Instead, it built a bridge of respect across that chasm, a fragile span that allowed them to meet in the middle, each of them whole and distinct. But as a fragile peace settled in the valley, a new omen appeared. The vultures, which usually soared so high they were mere specks against the blue, began to lower their circles. They flew with a patient, expectant grace, their shadows passing over the camp like a dark premonition. It was a sign of coming trouble, a harbinger of death. Miles away, in the foothills below the Red Valley, one of Ransom Pike's trackers knelt and pointed at the ground. It was a single, faint mark in the dust, the print of a woman's worn boot, a boot that did not belong in these mountains. It pointed upward, toward the hidden canyons. The tracker looked at his companion, a grim smile touching his lips. He had found the trail. The hunt was on. The message came via a child from the town. A boy paid a penny by Nellie to deliver a note to the edge of the wash where Dasan and Evelyn were hidden. The terms were set, an exchange. Her father for the original ledger page. It would happen at dusk in the center of Dry Willow Camp, the very place her father was held captive. It was a trap. They all knew it, but it was a trap they had to walk into, because the bait was a piece of Evelyn's heart. As the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, they made their move. Nellie had already done her part, riding hard to redemption and back, leaving copies of the ledger page with the circuit riding preacher and the head of the Merchants Association. Witnesses were now in place, holding their own slivers of the truth, an insurance policy written on cheap paper. Tio Miguel had arrived quietly, his old border guard instincts awakening. He blended into the gathering crowd of townsfolk and off-duty miners who had come to watch, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Dry Willow was a dusty square surrounded by rough-hewn buildings, dominated by a large supply warehouse. In the center of the square stood Ransom Pike, flanked by a half-dozen of his hired guns. Lieutenant Halford was there too, his blue uniform a stark symbol of corrupted authority, and between them, looking thin and frail, was Albert Hart, Evelyn's father. Evelyn walked into the square, Dasan a few steps behind her, a specter at the edge of the lantern light. He held the ledger page in his hand. The air was thick with tension, a silence broken only by the nervous shuffling of feet and the creak of leather. "The book," Pike said, his voice slick with arrogance. "Give it to me, and you get the old man." "First, let him go," Evelyn said, her voice shaking but clear. Halford laughed, a short, ugly sound. "That is not how this works. Miss Hart." He drew his revolver and fired a single shot into the air. The crowd flinched. The warning was clear. They were in control. As if the gunshot were a signal, Dasan vanished. He did not run. He simply melted into the deep shadows between the buildings. Pike's men tensed, their eyes darting into the darkness. A moment later, chaos erupted from the far side of the square. It was not a sound of attack, but of panic. The sharp, slicing sound of a knife through leather, followed by the terrified whinnies of horses. Dasan had moved to the picket line and cut the tethers. A dozen horses, suddenly free, bolted, stampeding through the camp, kicking up a thick, choking cloud of dust. Pike's men were thrown into confusion, some trying to control the panic, others trying to peer through the swirling dust for a target that was no longer there. Dasan used the chaos he had created. He was a phantom, a whisper of motion. A man would turn, and Dasan would be there, the hard barrel of a carbine striking a nerve, sending the man to the ground without a sound. He was not fighting a battle. He was dismantling a threat, piece by piece, using the darkness and the dust and the terrain as his weapons. The rhythm of the fight was starkly real, the heavy chunk of a lever-action carbine being cycled, the careful pause to aim, the quick movement to new cover. Evelyn ran to her father, throwing her arms around him as the camp dissolved into a mess of shouting and confusion. But their reunion was cut short. Lieutenant Halford, his face a mask of fury, strode through the dust and grabbed Evelyn by the arm, yanking her away from her father. He pressed the cold muzzle of his .44 revolver to her temple. "That is enough," Apache Halford bellowed into the darkness. "Show yourself, or the girl dies now." The dust began to settle. The remaining hired guns reformed a nervous circle around Pike. From the shadows near the warehouse, Dasan emerged. He held his carbine at his side. His face was calm, his eyes locked on Evelyn. He saw the terror in her eyes, and he saw the cold certainty in Halford's. This was the moment of choice. He could fight. He might even win. The odds were not impossible, but a single stray bullet, a moment's hesitation, and she would be lost. The victory would be ashes in his mouth. He looked at her, and the choice was not a choice at all. It was the only path his heart would allow him to walk. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his carbine on the ground. He raised his empty hands, a gesture of complete and total surrender. He chose her over the fight, over the victory, over himself. Pike smiled, a triumphant, predatory expression. "Now," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "That is much better." But as his men moved forward to take Dasan, a new actor joined the play. From the edge of the crowd, Tio Miguel, who had been standing unnoticed near a stack of barrels, made his move. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the lit oil lantern he was holding sailing through the air in a perfect, fiery arc. It crashed through the window of the large supply warehouse, the one with the U.S. Army ammunition crates stacked just inside, the one where the gunpowder was stored. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then a muffled whoomp, and the warehouse erupted in a volcano of orange and yellow flame. A wave of heat washed over the square, sending the crowd reeling backward. The fire illuminated the scene in a hellish, dancing light, and in that light, Ransom Pike's mask of civility was burned away. "Shoot them!" he screamed, his face contorted in a snarl of pure animal rage. "Shoot them all!" His words, meant for his men, echoed across the square, heard by every townsperson, every miner. They saw him not as a captain of industry, but as a murderer, willing to slaughter them all to protect his secrets. As if on cue, Nellie pushed her way to the front of the crowd. "You want proof," she yelled, her voice ringing with righteous fury. "Here's your proof." She threw a handful of papers into the air. The copies of the ledger page fluttered down into the crowd, illuminated by the fire. Men scrambled to pick them up, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension as they read the damning words. Whispers turned to angry murmurs. In the line of cavalry troopers, Halford had brought his backup. One young soldier, his face pale, slowly lowered the barrel of his rifle. In the chaos, the secondary explosion they had all feared happened. A barrel of black powder inside the warehouse ignited. The resulting blast was not huge, but it was powerful enough to send a shower of burning debris into the air and knock Lieutenant Halford from his feet. His grip on Evelyn broken. Ransom Pike, lost in his own rage, raised his pistol and fired wildly into the swirling smoke. Evelyn screamed as she saw Dasan stumble, a dark stain spreading across his pant leg. He had been hit. Halford scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild. He saw Dasan, wounded and exposed, and raised his revolver, aiming for his back. "No!" Evelyn screamed. But Dasan was already moving, ignoring the searing pain in his leg. He dropped to one knee, raising the pistol he had taken from one of Pike's men. The firelight glinted on the barrel. He did not aim for Pike's heart or his head. His shot was a single, sharp crack, a surgeon's cut in the fabric of the chaos. The bullet struck Ransom Pike's right hand, shattering the bone and sending his pistol flying into the dust. Pike screamed, a sound of pure agony and shock, clutching his ruined hand. The fight was over. The crowd, now an angry mob, began to surge forward. The soldiers, their loyalty broken, did nothing to stop them. Dasan, his leg bleeding freely, limped over to the whimpering Pike and, using the man's own gun belt, tied his hands securely. Pike looked up at him, his face a mess of tears and fury. "It is over," Dasan said, his voice low and steady, each word an iron nail in the coffin of Pike's empire. "Either way, you are going to court." Justice, for so long a distant rumor, had finally arrived in Dry Willow, carried not on the word of the law, but on the back of courage, and illuminated by the cleansing fire of truth. The aftermath of the fire was a landscape of ash and reckoning. The sun rose on the smoldering ruins of the warehouse, casting a pale, uncertain light on the changed world of Dry Willow Camp. The law arrived not with the thunder of cavalry, but with the quiet, deliberate pace of a single man on a tired horse. Circuit Judge Morrison was a man whose face was as weathered and impartial as the law he carried in his saddlebags. He set up his court on the porch of the main building, and the town of Redemption came to bear witness. The legal proceedings were swift and brutal. Faced with the signed ledger, a dozen copies in the hands of the town's most respected citizens, and the unified testimony of the very people he had terrorized, Ransom Pike's empire of lies crumbled to dust. Lieutenant Halford, stripped of his insignia in a humiliating public display, was arrested and taken away by federal marshals, his career ending not with a bang but with the quiet click of handcuffs. Pike himself, his hand crudely bandaged, was handed over to the county sheriff, a sullen, broken man destined for a cell and a hangman's rope. The official story, written in ink and sealed with authority, had been consumed by the fire, and a new one, written in the hearts of the people, had risen from its ashes. The personal consequences were quieter, but no less profound. They had found shelter in a small, abandoned line shack a mile from the camp, a place Tio Miguel had secured for them. Dasan lay on a narrow cot, his leg bandaged and propped on a rolled-up blanket. The bullet had gone clean through the muscle, a painful but not a crippling wound. Evelyn had cleaned it with whiskey, a task she performed with a steady hand that surprised her, and had fashioned a splint from a broken chair leg and strips of her own petticoat. She was adjusting the bindings, her touch gentle and focused. He watched her, the severe lines of his face softened by pain and a quiet gratitude. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her eyes not leaving her work. He was silent for a moment. "It hurts less than when you laugh at other people," he said, his voice a low, dry murmur. She looked up, a small, surprised smile touching her lips. The shared joke, a callback to her own clumsiness in the early days, was an intimate thread connecting their past to their present. It was a language they had built together, word by word, in the crucible of the wilderness. Back in Redemption, the seeds of their victory began to take root in the town's stony soil. Tio Miguel, without a word to anyone, took a crowbar from behind his saloon and walked to the crooked post at the edge of town with a single, powerful wrench. He tore the "No Indians After Sundown" sign from its post. He did not break it or burn it. He simply carried it back to his saloon and used it to patch a hole in his woodshed. A final, practical act of disrespect for the hatred it represented. The townsfolk watched. No one protested. The sign's absence left a clean space against the sky, a small but significant change in the landscape of their world. The Apache were no longer just shadows or legends. They were people, led by a man who had stood his ground for a white woman and, in doing so, had fought for them all. But the healing in the community did not erase the deep, old wounds of Dasan's own people. A messenger from his clan arrived, a young boy who spoke with the elder's grave voice. The news of the fire and of Dasan's part in it had traveled on the wind. The clan was afraid. Pike had friends, powerful men who would not forget. The soldiers, humiliated, might seek a different kind of vengeance. The council had decided they would move on, journeying north into the higher, more inaccessible mountains, disappearing until the danger had passed. The news settled a heavy weight on Dasan. He was caught between two worlds, two loyalties. He looked at Evelyn, her face etched with concern, and he felt the brutal tearing of his heart. To go with his people was to leave her. To stay with her was to be cut off from the only life he had ever known. To abandon his family in a time of fear. He was a warrior of the Red Rock Canyons, and he was being asked to choose which part of his own soul he was willing to lose. That night, under a sliver of a new moon, they walked to the small stream that ran behind the shack. The water whispered over stones that were still blackened from a grass fire long ago, a testament to the land's cycle of destruction and rebirth. He sat on the bank, his wounded legs stretched out before him, and she sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. He unfolded the old deerskin blanket, the one that had been their first boundary and their first shared shelter, and wrapped it around both of them. It smelled of smoke and sage and the history they now shared. For a long time, they were silent, listening to the water flow over the fire-scorched rocks. Life was moving on, cleansing the scars of the past. "I remember that first night in the cave," she said softly, her voice barely more than a breath. "The cold." He nodded, his gaze on the dark, flowing water. "You stayed awake all night," she continued. "I could feel it. You were watching, waiting for danger." He turned his head, and in the faint starlight, she could see the depth in his eyes. He reached out and gently touched her face, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "I do not stay awake because I'm afraid anymore," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "I only stay awake now so I can remember." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that held all the fear, all the pain, and all the fierce, unwavering loyalty that had brought them to this moment. It was a kiss of promises kept and futures yet to be written. The world faded away, leaving only the two of them, wrapped in a deerskin blanket under a new moon, safe in the knowledge that they had chosen each other. The next morning, as Dasan was wrestling with his impossible choice, Evelyn came to him, her eyes bright with an idea. She had been talking to her father, to Nellie, to Tio Miguel. She had been looking at the scorched earth and the flowing water and seeing not an end, but a beginning. "We cannot erase what happened," she said, her voice full of a new, vibrant energy. "But we can build something over the ashes. This land is thirsty. Everyone who passes through is thirsty. Soldiers, settlers, Apache. It does not matter. Thirst makes everyone the same." She proposed her idea: a way station. Right here, a place with a clean well, a bunkhouse for weary travelers, and a corral with fresh hay, a place where anyone, regardless of the color of their skin or the uniform they wore, could find water and rest. A bridge, a place of peace. Nellie, who had been listening from the doorway, grinned her wide, toothy grin. "It is a fine idea," she said. "What are you going to call it?" Evelyn looked at Dasan, a playful light in her eyes. "Bed and water," she said. "We have a bed, and we have water. No trouble allowed." The wind that blew through the high desert carried a new sound, not of gunfire or fear, but of hammers and saws. The change that had been sparked in the fire at Dry Willow was now being built, board by board, into something solid and real. The trial of Ransom Pike was a formality, a quiet postscript to a war that had already been won in the court of public opinion. with the ledger as proof and a dozen townspeople as witnesses to his final, desperate orders. His conviction was a certainty. A portion of his seized assets was set aside as compensation for the families of the wagon train, a small, inadequate apology from a legal system that had been so slow to act. But the true victory was not in the verdict. It was in the silence at the edge of the Red Valley, where the progress of the iron rails had come to a dead stop. The railroad company, faced with a federal investigation and a local population that was no longer cowed into silence, was forced into the one thing Pike had never considered negotiation. The land, they were learning, could not simply be taken. Its price now had to be discussed with the people who called it home. The bed and water station rose from the ashes of the old line shack, a testament to Evelyn's vision and the community's newfound conscience. Her father, Albert, found a new purpose in the construction, his farmer's hands rediscovering their strength as he helped raise the walls of the new bunkhouse. Tio Miguel provided the lumber and the knowledge, his cynical exterior hiding a deep well of decency that had finally found an outlet. Even some of the miners from Redemption would show up after their shifts, offering a few hours of labor in exchange for a hot meal and a cup of coffee. Their respect for Dasan and Evelyn a tangible thing. Dasan's choice had resolved itself in a way he had never imagined. He did not have to leave his world or abandon his love. He became the bridge, his clan. Seeing the railroads halt and the town's change of heart, had decided not to retreat into the high mountains. They remained in their valley, their freedom secured not by isolation, but by a newfound, hard-won respect. Dasan now walked a path between both worlds. He was a warrior who had laid down his gun not in defeat, but in a profound act of love, and in doing so, had become a different kind of protector. His honor was not diminished. It was expanded, redefined. He was still Apache. His heart still belonged to the Red Rocks, but he now understood that a true warrior fights not just to defend a border, but to build a space where peace can grow. Evelyn, too, had completed her own long journey. The girl who had dreamed of a distant, perfect grove of orange trees was gone. In her place stood a woman who had found her purpose not in a dream, but in the dusty, imperfect reality she had helped to create. She was no longer a passenger in her own life, but a builder, a partner, an architect of the future. Her hands were calloused, her face was tanned by the sun, and her eyes held the steady, clear gaze of someone who knew her own worth. She had not found a paradise. She had built a sanctuary. The social fabric of the territory, so frayed and torn, began to slowly reweave itself into a new pattern. There were still whispers of hate, a bitter minority who clung to the old prejudices. But the pragmatic soul of the West had asserted itself. Most people, miners and merchants and farmers alike, came to a simple, unadorned conclusion that peace was cheaper than war. A watering hole that served everyone was better for business than a battlefield that served no one. The world had not been magically transformed into a place of universal brotherhood, but it had become a place where kindness was no longer seen as a weakness, but as a practical and profitable investment. The final image of their new life was one of simple, profound peace. The bed and water station was complete. A long, clean trough, fed by a new well, offered water to any horse that passed. On a bench by the door, a large enamel coffee pot was always simmering over a small cast-iron stove, its rich aroma a constant, welcoming invitation. And hanging above the door was a simple, hand-painted sign. It showed a single blue drop of water and a single red flicker of flame, their two worlds, their two histories, finally joined together. One night, long after the last traveler had settled in the bunkhouse and a deep, quiet stillness had fallen over the land, Evelyn and Dasan sat outside, wrapped in the old deerskin blanket. The moon was nearly full, a benevolent, silver disk in the vast, velvet sky. It cast a gentle light on the familiar contours of his face, the face she had once seen as a mask of terror and now knew as the geography of her own heart. She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart. "Do you still stay awake all night for me?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze on the moonlit mountains, the silent, eternal witnesses to their story. "Yes," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble that vibrated through her. "But now, it is to watch you breathe, not to watch for bullets." He held her closer, and under the watchful eye of the moon, the promise made on a cold, desperate night in a hidden cave was fulfilled, not as an end to a story, but as the quiet, steady beginning of a life. The freedom of the West, they had discovered, was not found in the vastness of the land or the power of a gun. It was found in the simple, courageous choice to offer a cup of water to a thirsty soul, to choose kindness when all the easier paths led to cruelty. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are tuning in from in the comments so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And remember to subscribe to Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can reach more listeners.